Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Philip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter, GBH News for Investigative Reporting, and your host. Tonight, criminal justice reform. A new report on the state of criminal justice reform in Massachusetts was just released. Researchers found crime and incarceration rates fell almost by half in the last 10 years. Most after 2018, when two reform laws passed in the Commonwealth. Now, some of the success was due to a financial investment of more than $30 million annually in reentry programs for people leaving prison. Those are some of the bright spots. But the report also revealed a huge racial disparity of who remains behind bars, suggesting there's a lot more to do. Joining me tonight to discuss the report on criminal justice reform, Sophia Hall. She's the Deputy Litigation Director for Lawyers for Civil Rights in Boston. Radha Natarajan is the Executive Director of the New England Innocence Project. Rahsaan Hall, he's President and CEO of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. And Leon Smith, Executive Director, Citizens for Juvenile Justice. Welcome, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you for
Good to have you. Let's talk about the data. This is we have some basic data points. And essentially it's saying that, I guess what the report is trying to say is that things are better relative to pre-2018. And I want to know what you think in summary form. Let's start with you, Sophia. What does the data suggest in summary?
Yeah, Philip, I appreciate that. I appreciate that the report acknowledges some of the shortcomings, but it sort of touts the outcomes in a way that it misses the forest for the trees, right? One of the charges of this bill was to get to the core of the systemic disparities that exist in our carceral system. It really failed to do that. And without that, we can't say 5 years or 10 years from now we'll be doing any better. Taking just a snapshot without looking at that larger zoomed out lens means that we're still behind. We don't know how to move forward. And so that's really concerning that the data that we feel positive about is just that small snapshot of what we've seen.
A small snapshot. And what do you think, Radha?
I think that the data from the report, it actually doesn't tell a new story, it tells an old story. And that's about racism and the criminal legal system. And the only way that there's going to be dramatic changes is if we remove discretion from police and prosecutors. I think a really important data point is in terms of motor vehicle infractions. So white people over that period of time saw a quarter reduction in motor vehicle infractions, motor vehicle violations. And when you think about that, we all drive, but the police decide who they're going to stop, who they're going to charge with a crime for what happens in their car. Black people saw about a third of a reduction in motor vehicle violations, and Latinos saw an increase in motor vehicle violations during that entire time. So if we're going to reduce racial disparities, we have to take discretion out of people who are making decisions about who they're going to charge with crimes.
And some progress, Rahsaan, but also obviously hearing from your colleagues here, not enough.
Absolutely. And that's as an advocate, as one of the folks who was doing the advocacy to get these laws passed and these reforms implemented, we knew that we would see the disparities persist. We were hopeful that the collection of data and the requirement to gather more data would reveal some hidden truths about how this system operates, but we knew that the disparities were going to exist. That said, I think there is a celebratory moment for those of us who advocated, because all along we were saying, if you introduce these reforms, we'll be better off. We might not get to the heart of the racial disparities, but we'll have fewer people who are incarcerated, fewer people who are arrested. All along, law enforcement were saying, if you make these reforms, we will be less safe. The converse is true. We've seen declines in crime, violent crime as well. Certainly there are localized issues, but overall we've seen reductions. The sky didn't fall, so here we are, Chicken Little.
Here we are, Chicken Little. James, what do you think?
So anytime you have fewer people entering the system, fewer people being incarcerated, that's certainly a positive. However, whenever we look at data, and I just commend this report because data is so important and a key part to doing advocacy work, because that's how we really truly measure not just how the system is working overall, but how the system works for different parts of our population. So I'm happy that things are trending down. However, when you look at the sheer level of racial disparities, when you look at racial disparities in incarceration, and you see that incarceration fell precipitously for white residents, but nowhere near as much for black and brown residents. When you look at the fact that the gap in incarceration between black and brown residents and white residents is significantly broader than we see than the national average, which also mirrors what we see in the juvenile system, where a December report from the Sentencing Project found that we have the worst Latino-white racial disparities in youth incarceration in America, and the fourth worst black-white disparities in incarceration in America. This is a positive step. Reform works, but we will not fully recognize the promise of criminal justice reform until we deal with those persistent racial disparities.
And you work mainly with youth, and let's talk about who is still behind bars in disproportionate numbers. The report from Boston Indicators, Boston Foundation, MassINC, is that we've seen some good news of late. For example, I guess it can only be considered good news that Concord Prison just closed down. I guess it can only be considered good news that there is a different policy toward youth criminality in the Commonwealth. What does that say, again, when you juxtapose the news out of Massachusetts in juxtaposition with what's happening in the rest of the country, which seems to be going backwards in terms of the very term criminal reform? Reform seems to be almost like a curse word for people who are seeing folks running into supermarkets and taking food, or you've seen these photographs and videos on television, right? Where they show mobs, as they call them, running into flash mobs, as they call them, running into stores and grabbing things. And then the response has been, we don't need criminal reform. We need harsher penalties. So how does it look compared to the rest of the country, Sophia, here in Massachusetts?
Well, we live in a racialized country. None of us can deny that.
Indeed.
We have always had a rhetoric about fear-mongering, about conflating criminality with people with black and brown skin. None of that is new, and none of that is going away. I think what this report does for us is at least gives us something to work with, as my brother Leon said, right? It gives us some data to point to. But I think it's also important for people in Massachusetts to realize that our figures were not great 20 years ago. So when we say we are improving, it means we are coming from someplace bad to someplace less bad. And I don't know that that should be something that we applaud in the way that we do.
Rasan?
Yeah, I mean, to Sophia's point, right, we're going to hyper-focus on the bad conduct of black and brown folks. But that narrative is so problematic, and it fuels the resistance to some of these very reforms. I do think there is another component that's missing, and the report talks about this, is the level of investment. The whole purpose behind, or one of the main purposes of this.
I was going to ask you about
that. Was to take some of the savings that came from fewer people being incarcerated and reinvesting it in community. I think the challenge for me is how it got reinvested, mostly SSYI grants, and I'm blanking on the initials. Maybe Leon can help me. But essentially, those tend to be more law enforcement oriented and associated programs. I'm of the mind if you give the people the money to address the problems that they know they have themselves, we'll get far better outcomes. But to your point around the rhetoric and the narrative and the fear mongering, we'll take the smash and grab that happens at Neiman Marcus in Chicago and spread that all across the country to scare people into thinking that we still need to double down on these old tactics that lead to these gross racial disparities and the huge number of people who are incarcerated, while not keeping us actually safer.
And it also obfuscates the larger picture, doesn't it? The very point that you're making. I'm hearing when I'm out on my reporting role, I'm hearing people talk about these smash and grabs. Even though it's not happening here, it's having an impact on the very notion of criminal justice reform. So, Raja and Leon, what steps can be taken to basically change that picture, in your view, in the eyes and minds of people who are watching these scenes play out across the United States?
So I think one of the first things, and I think this is important for here too, is that media plays a really significant role in fear-mongering. When there's a focus on harm that's being committed instead of all the good that communities are doing within those communities, of the things that people are doing to help each other, it sends a picture, it inflames those fears, and I think that's really significant. I did want to go back to one point that I think was important, which is that there's a data point that right now black people are incarcerated in Massachusetts at 7 times the rate of white people. And that comes from the report. That number really stuck out to me because nationally, you are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder if you are black than if you are white. And of course, our work centers on wrongful convictions too. And these are folks who the media portrayed as the most dangerous people that exist, and they were innocent. And I just think that these racial disparities go throughout the system, whether you're innocent, whether you're guilty. It's more about who you are than what you do. And I think that's important for people to understand.
And when, well, that's so true. And that's particularly true, I think, probably for youth. Leon, you work primarily with youth. When Deval Patrick signed this legislation in 2018, there was a lot of talk about the public not understanding that the brain development of young people was substantially different from that of adults, and thus you have to look at that as a mitigating factor in criminal justice reform. Have any of those things been apparent in terms of that is to say, has any of that legislation shown up in the work that you're doing now in terms of how police approach youth, how the courts are approaching youth?
So, one, just to pick up on Rassan's comments, we have to always, one, what we've seen happen is a revival of the same playbook from the mid-'90s.
The tough on crime.
The super predators panic.
That's right.
Mass incarceration was largely fueled by stereotypical, racist, negative, harsh rhetoric directed towards black and brown youth and black and brown communities. And we've seen that same playbook. They may not use the word super predator, but when you talk about kids, still developing kids being dangerous and violent, even in the education space, we see 5- and 6-year-old children being suspended from school. How do you call a 5-year-old child violent? But we see those terms being placed on black and brown young people all of the time, being used when harsh narratives are not checked and challenged. They go on to create harsh and negative policies that decimate black and brown communities. So at CFJJ, one of the things that we do, we really focus on narrative change, challenging the narrative, never letting it go unchecked, using data like we see in this report, using research and best practices to say, no, you're not going to take that one isolated case and use it to say this is all that's happening. We are always going to push back and say, what is the data saying? With that being said, I look at this report as well, and it's an affirmation that juvenile justice reform works. You look, for example, at the data point about emerging adults and the 20% drop for 18 to 24. I tie that to the juvenile justice reforms that were included in the Criminal Justice Reform Act. Diversion, which is all about the research which establishes when you direct young people away from the formal system to community-based services that address root causes and their underlying needs, those young people become less likely to reoffend and end up in the system. But when you send those young people to formal processing, they become more likely to reoffend. So in the Criminal Justice Reform Act, we had diversion. We raised the lower age from 7 to 12 to keep young children out. We decriminalized certain offenses, for example, like disturbing a school assembly, which was a major factor in pushing young people into the school-to-prison pipeline. When you make that investment, coupled with funding directed towards addressing youth needs in the community, not only do you get an immediate return on investment for young people, as we've seen the juvenile justice system over the last 15 years decrease in size, but that return on investment pays forward because those young people also don't end up in the system after they turn 18.
And what you're explaining also is probably part of the answer to the next question is why should folks care? Folks who are watching this program, people who are sitting in the home right now, they hear the term criminal reform, but it probably doesn't resonate. You're trying to explain why they should care. Why should they care, Rahsaan?
One, because it works. And two, because the alternative is worse for our communities. And so to the extent that people were worried that if you just give kids a slap on the wrist, because that was the critique of raising the age. My God, if the only tool we have is to arrest and incarcerate 7 to 11-year-olds, what does that say about us as a society? But if we make an investment in some of the resources that are evidence-based, that show you get better outcomes when you address these underlying root causes, we'll be much better off. And so I think people need to recognize that we'll get better outcomes. And despite the narratives of smash and grabs and carjacking, which are happening, but let's look at the alternatives of how we address those root causes so that we don't have the smash and grabs and the carjackings or any other narrative that the media puts out there to drive that fear-mongering. So it's so important, and it's a better use of our resources and investment in people and not expanding the footprint of the criminal legal system.
Transitional housing was one of the points that was made in this report. Not enough of it. We're talking about $30 million investment, but it's a drop in the bucket of what's needed in order to assist folks who are leaving prison, returning citizens. Sophia, without that money and without other steps, what are we losing the reform part of criminal justice reform?
I mean, it should not be a surprise to anyone that there is not enough housing, right? There's not enough housing for people, for professionals who are middle-aged, who have had the ability to have access to education and opportunities. There is certainly not enough housing for people who are exiting the carceral system with no support and generally negative rhetorics about who they are and what their future is going to hold. I think this is yet another example of how we don't think about criminal justice reform as a culture shift. I think what I hear from all of my colleagues when we talk about this issue is that we are trying to change hearts and minds, right? We are trying to say that it's more than a punitive system, that we believe that all people deserve access to a full and inclusive life so they can contribute back to their community. If you believe in community and that inclusive notion of community, why would you not want to put dollars and cents to people having a roof over their head? But you can drive down any street in the city of Boston and see people sleeping outside. And if we don't care about the people outside our windows, then we know we don't care about the people coming out of our jails.
Well, there doesn't seem to be enough integration of issues. We talk about these things in silos. You have people sleeping at the airport who are migrants. You have people who are sleeping at the transportation building who are migrants. And the way these issues are sometimes discussed, it pits people against each other. And so now you're talking about folks who need transitional housing, who are returning citizens, and some of the questions that are being raised is, aren't they taking housing from other folks who need it here and there? What's your thought, Rod?
I mean, I think there is a direct connection to prisons and what happens afterwards, in that if our prison system did not break people so thoroughly and try to dehumanize people so thoroughly, they wouldn't need the level of supports that they have when they get out of prison. For our folks who have been in prison for things they didn't do for 30, 40, 50 years, they still come out with all of the things that prison tries to do to people, to try to take away from them, and they don't have the ability to come back into our communities and be able to give all of their gifts in a way that we want them to. And I think the reality is that why people should care is that incarceration actually is not the thing that's making us safer. We need to close Concord. We need to not just close Concord. We need to close more than Concord. And we need to invest that money in prevention, and we wouldn't need to put so much in reentry if prisons were not treating people the way that they are.
Absolutely. And just to build on that, Frederick Douglass once said it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And when Rada talks about how
props for quoting Frederick Douglass. You can quote Frederick Douglass, I'll give you mad props. Go ahead.
But Rada talks about breaking people. When we look at, for example, 18 to 20-year-olds, many of whom have not finished high school, and we put them in that adult, harsh, punitive environment, it doesn't just break them in the moment, but it increases the likelihood that they will continue to cycle in and out of the system. As my grandmother used to say, doing life 3 years at a time. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't make it better. It doesn't create a situation where it doesn't happen anymore. It does exactly the opposite. So, for example, for 18 to 20-year-olds who are in the adult criminal justice system who touch an adult facility, there's a 76% recidivism rate for rearrest and a 55% recidivism rate for reconviction. If being tough on crime deters crime, then why do we see that it actually increases? You take 18 to 20-year-olds who conversely are kept in the juvenile system, the Department of Youth Services, where they have access to education with a pathway towards a diploma, where they have access to treatment and counseling and therapy that addresses underlying trauma, where they have greater family involvement in case planning. Those recidivism rates cut in half. So really the picture of criminal justice reform, it's about long-term public safety, because you're not breaking young people, you're providing support to young people who are still developing, and you're basically saying you're off track, but we're going to get you on track.
Such an important point, long-term. Look, this report is it's sober. It's not attempting to be celebratory and so on and so forth. But there are aspects of it, I assume, that we can celebrate. So let's take the last few minutes of this program to see what is it in the report, Rasan, that might be considered a reason for, if not celebration, a reason for hope.
I think I started with this, is that we've seen the reductions in arrests and crime with a corresponding reduction, or arrests and incarceration, rather, with a corresponding reduction in crime rates. And I think that's a positive thing, separate and apart from the gross racial disparities that are persistent. And I think another thing to celebrate in the report is the intentional calling out of the need to address those racial disparities and the intentionality needed to build out a more robust data set. Unfortunately, we know what's happening, but without the data, it's hard to convince lawmakers that this path is the path that we need to continue to stay on.
And Sophia, your thoughts about that?
I think what's most important about this report is that it yells to me that this is the beginning, not the end of the conversation. What I hope everyone takes away from it is the investment that's so critical in tracking these disparities much more closely. I think 5 years from now, if we do the work, we may actually be at the core causes of what causes these numbers. And that's what this bill was intended to do. It also should cut against the opposition in terms of this sort of criminality piece that are constantly being thrown around. At least we now have new language and new resources to talk about when we combat the opposition who uses those fear-mongering tactics.
Thrown around and resurfacing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Leon, and then I'm going to have you end on the final word here.
The importance of transparency and having this type of data. For a long time, there was a great deal of opacity in Massachusetts where we didn't have this type of data, not just on the system overall, but really looking at how the system treats people by race. For a long time, we didn't have that. This is why it's important. People who come with these types of narratives and fear-mongering, we always have to stop and say, does the data support that? It doesn't. And to Sophia's point, we need to continue to push for this type of data in public records. So anytime people start these narratives, we say, no, we're going to look at the data, because in truth, the data shows that reform does work.
And you're saying this report helped in that sense?
This data, to Rasan's point, it's the receipts that the reform that we all fought for worked, and we need to continue on the same path.
The receipts. Rather, what
All right, 2 points.
Yeah.
Incarceration, it shows that incarceration is not the solution to public safety, and that decarceration and decriminalization work. That's number one. And number two, going off transparency, we need accountability in the criminal legal system. We can't call it a criminal justice system unless we see those racial disparities, we see that decriminalization, we see that decarceration. We need to see money in community. So we need these reports for accountability, for DOC, for everyone who is in the criminal legal system. We need that. And so in that sense, it is good.
This report was a long time coming, and it's 5 years since we engaged criminal justice reform seriously obviously. And those are your takeaways. I really appreciate it. Folks, that's the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. It goes fast. Thank you to all of our guests, and thank you for watching. Now, stay with us as we continue this conversation on our digital platforms, YouTube and Facebook. I'm Philip Martin, your host. We are on YouTube and Facebook with our post show, continuing our discussion on criminal justice reform in Massachusetts. One of the issues, rather, that I was wondering about is how the report was prepared. There's questions about, I mean, when reports are done, of course, there's a lot of academic of research and so on and so forth. But sometimes there's concern that you're not really talking to the people who we should be talking with. Is that the case here?
Absolutely. And I think there's two examples of that. I think one is that there are no accounts or the voice of anyone who is directly impacted. And I think that that's really significant. And the other thing is a focus on quantitative versus qualitative data.
Right.
I think it's important to know like how things are really happening and to get the experiences of folks, because of course the data shows that there's racial disparities, but you don't need the data to show that. We all know that from our lives, that racial disparities are baked into the system. So I think that it is important to get those voices too. And I do think that that's lacking. And I appreciate that it's a starting point and that there are so many ways in which we have to get directly impacted people to tell this story.
But that's not a small thing. I mean, that's huge. The notion of not bringing in folks who are directly impacted by this. Rasan, you work with a lot of these individuals and have. Did you find those voices missing in such a way that it compromised the report or made the report less than compelling?
Wow, now I feel attacked because I was one of the people that they consulted before the release, and I was like, yeah, I mean, here's some things that you should point out. Right. I didn't say, I mean, we need to have the voices of directly impacted people, but I do think from a narrative perspective, that is tremendously important. I think MassINC and the Boston Indicators do a good job of culling the data and setting the data up to advance narratives, but the meat on the bone, so to speak, is the real lived experience of people whose lives have been changed either positively or negatively because of this. I will say that during the release of the report, they had an individual who was formerly incarcerated and impacted by this, but clearly, you know, that was one person, and there's so many people's lives who have been impacted by this.
You know, and one of the aspects of the report, a key aspect that's pointed out in the summary, of course, is who's still behind bars in disproportionate numbers. And Sophia, the work that you do on a daily basis, when you the whole notion of quantity and quality. Do you feel or see that the criminal justice reform has had a major impact just in the work that you do on a daily basis? Does it feel like things are different?
Philip, I still have job security at Lawyers for Civil Rights. There are still countless individuals sending those emails, ringing the phone, asking us for help because they feel as though they've been discriminated in various aspects of their life, but in particular when engaging with our police and engaging with our courts and engaging with our criminal justice system. That has not decreased at all. What the hope is, right, is that we do spend the next 5 years looking at those systemic issues that lead to that response. And then maybe we have a trickle down. And then maybe we have another conversation 5 years from now with some of our clients, and we're able to really say, yes, I feel a difference. Yes, I see a difference.
And, you know, that difference, of course, your clients at that point are, we hope, will not be some of the youth of today. And I'm just wondering, Leon, if this report shed any light for you in terms of progress with working with youth that might have been different from a few years ago.
So to Rada's point, that qualitative point is so important because there's a harm to system involvement. And when you look at from the perspective of a young person, when a young person ends up going into the adult system, that's a young person who's on a pathway to getting their high school diploma, and that's disrupted. That's a young person who's been, just from my experience as an attorney, who's been impacted by trauma, and mom has been talking about how he or she needs help, and they haven't gotten it, and rather than getting help, now they're in a incarcerated setting, which is only going to bring more trauma. So when we look at young people who are still developing.
Disproportionately black and brown?
Disproportionately black and brown. To me, that's the story. It's not just a graph with data points. Those are real people, real young people, real lives. And not only does it disrupt their life in the moment, when you look at the collateral harm of criminal justice involvement, what a criminal justice record does to a young person's future outcomes, ability to make a living. We're talking about long-term harm, which disrupts the future of our young people rather than putting them on a better path.
That's one of the other issues I want to ask you about. But the whole notion of CODA still, I mean, the whole notion of these things still following you around the rest of your life, where people are still burdened with housing problems, still burdened with finding a job because they still have this living legacy attached to them, so on and so forth. Does criminal reform do anything to make it easier for these folks to re-enter society in a way that they're not always asked about, have you served time in prison?
Not really. I mean, I think the Corey reform legislation that was passed, what was that, in 2010?
The Corey reform, that's right.
You know, get rid of the box. But the reality is there's still ways for employers to find out whether or not someone has a Corey or a criminal offender record. You know, when people are able to be denied housing or employment opportunities, that is a significant impact. And so the scarlet letter of incarceration continues to follow them around. And this is separate and apart from the trauma that they've been exposed to while incarcerated, whether it's from other people that they're incarcerated with or the guards within the facility. I will say that, and the report talks about this, is some of the investment that has happened in reentry services. And, you know, I think there's some tension, again, in where we're putting this money. Is it a further expansion of the carceral system, and now we're just placing it in reentry services, as opposed to community-based programs and services that will help get people back on their feet? But the more money that we're directing towards helping people transition, to get the housing, to get the mental health services and support, to get the employment opportunities, I think that's what's key. At the Urban League, those are some of the things that we're trying to put in place so that we can help make sure that we're receiving folks and smoothing that transition. But there's so many roadblocks and barriers that continue to exist in that respect.
Philip, it makes me think about your earlier comment in terms of the opposition benefits by us siloing these discussions that are very much interrelated. So it can't help an individual who is released from incarceration to go to transitional housing if they then don't have any access to a job, if there's no job opportunity consistent with that. And so I think that, one of the things that we, again, have to think about is a culture shift. Do we really believe in second chances in Massachusetts? And if we do, then we have to build in better systems and better resources for what happens after individuals are released from jail and before they ever enter that system.
Such a key point, and we're going to, I'm messing up all the C words today, so let's have the coda to this discussion, rather. The Sean Ellises of the world in the context of criminal reform, people who are innocent but have spent time behind bars. Do you see any light there in the context of this report?
So I'll note a couple things. One is that the report doesn't at all recognize the even existence of wrongful convictions. They assume that every arrest and every conviction is okay, is just, is reliable. And so Sean Ellis is, in one sense, completely absent, the Sean Ellises. However, in terms of giving funding to community groups who are doing this work, that's what Sean Ellis is leading in our community, is community-based support for people who are coming out of long-term incarceration. But I want to go to, one thing that did happen is decriminalization. And I feel like it doesn't start with what do you do after someone's convicted. You don't have to enter the criminal legal system in order for you to get the support so that everyone is safer. That is something that should happen before. And I think a good example of that is they look at pretrial detention. These are folks who are presumed innocent. The pretrial detention racial disparity has gotten worse during the course of the data collection in this report and after reforms in Massachusetts. The pretrial detention population for white people went down significantly, much less so for black people, and it went up for Latinos. And I think that that's really significant because these are folks who have not been shown to have done anything. And simply as a result of arrest and the discretion that's placed in our system, so much is taken away from them. They lose their jobs. They can lose housing. They can lose their kids. This happens before they're ever convicted. So I think we need to start way before thinking about what should we do after someone is convicted. We need to give people the support they need. We need to give communities the support that we need to prevent crime, but also to make sure that everyone is seen as redeemable, because realistically, they are.
Okay, that's it for our show. And there are so many things we didn't get around to talking about, bail reform, for example. But Sophia, Rasan, Leon, rather, I want to thank you all for being here and taking part in this extraordinary discussion.
Absolutely.
All right.
Appreciate it.